Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. We're very excited to be with you today because we are going to be unveiling information about something you've all been waiting for. More information about the Mount Ebal Curse Tablet that ABR discovered in December of 2019. Joining me here today is my co-host, Scott Lancer. Scott, welcome.
It's good to be here.
It's great to see you, my friend.
Good to see you.
And our distinguished guest, friend, mentor, and brother in the Lord, archaeologist Dr. Scott Stripling. How are you, Scott?
I'm excellent. Glad to be here.
All right. Well, we are here today, friends, to talk about the Mount Ebal Curse Tablet. Now, if you haven't heard about this discovery before, stay tuned. We're going to be here for 4 episodes to tell you all about it. So we're going to go deep. We're going to share with you details, a lot of details that haven't been unveiled yet, but we're very excited to talk about this subject. So get ready to go. 4 episodes of Digging for Truth. All right, gentlemen, we are going to do what we always do. We're going to jump right in. Okay, so I guess we should begin at the beginning, not in Genesis 1, but we're talking about Mount Ebal, which is mentioned in the book of Joshua and in Deuteronomy, Scott. So let's get it started. Let's start there. Let's talk about the biblical text first, because that's priority here at ABR. Yep. So let's roll.
Well, let's even go back earlier than that. When the Bible's talking in Genesis about Abraham is at Shechem, Isaac is at Shechem, Jacob is at Shechem, it doesn't tell you, because the readers knew this, that Mount Gerizim is on one side of Shechem and Mount Ebal is on the other.
Right.
So Abram's interactions there, and then the Abrahamic covenant, you can see Shechem from where he does this at Elam Moreh. So the Abrahamic covenant is cut there, and so then when we read in Deuteronomy 11 that Moses is telling them, when you gain a foothold in the land, go to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and renew covenant there. It's the Abrahamic covenant. That's why they're going back to this place. And then Deuteronomy 27, you get some very specific instructions about what to do. You're going to build an altar, you're going to coat it with plaster and so forth. And then in Joshua 8:30, it specifically says that Joshua did build an altar on Mount Ebal to the Lord, very specifically following what Moses had said. So you've got the Genesis account to think about, you've got the 2 Deuteronomy references, and then you have the Joshua reference.
So you do have to go back to Genesis, don't we?
Yeah.
I said not quite to Genesis 1:1,
yeah.
But the patriarchal roots are very deep.
And Scott, in this case, Moses wanted the Israelites to renew the covenant there, and you've said there's a good reason for that. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, let's think about the aspects of covenant and what it was like in the ancient Near East, say in the late Bronze Age. How did you cut covenant with God? Well, there's a greater party and there's a lesser party. There are consequences, blessings and curses, and we see this all the way starting in Genesis 3, and each biblical covenant has this aspect to it. There are witnesses. Like Moses says, I call heaven and earth today as witnesses against you, that I set before you life and death. Choose life, he says. So this renewal, you're coming out of Egyptian captivity, you're coming back to the very place where God made this land promise to Abram, and now you're back in the land and you're going to affirm the blessings and the curses. All the benefits that are going to happen if I keep the covenant, all the negative consequences that are going to inure to me if I violate the covenant. So it has to be there because it's a reaffirmation of the Abrahamic covenant. And remember, what they're carrying with them are the bones of Joseph. So they've come out of Egypt and all through the wilderness carrying poor Joseph's bones. And where do they bury him? Right there.
Yeah. So these roots here, I want to explore this a little bit more. Like when you go there today, and you've been there many times, we're talking about Shechem, or Nablus is the modern name. I mean, you're mentioning Jacob. What are some of the things that folks actually see at Shechem? And talk about a little bit about John 4.
Okay, so if you go to Nablus today, Nablus comes from Neapolis, the New Testament city that Herod built there, Neapolis. So you can see a lot of Roman ruins mixed in the modern city of Neapolis today, if you know where to look. So you can visit those Roman ruins. You can go to the well. The John 4 well is in a beautiful church there. And this is Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well. And she says to Jesus, remember, you worship in Jerusalem, we worship on this mountain, talking about Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritan community was and still is to this day. You have the tomb of Joseph that you can visit to this day. And so, again, that's a reminder of those deep patriarchal roots. And then finally, Tel Balata, the ancient site of Shechem, with the temple of Baal Berith. So there's a lot to see and a lot of connections to make when you go there.
Cool. So let's. I'm going to ask you one. I want you to give a little demonstration of the Deuteronomy 28 exchange that went there. Just give us. People can read their Bible. There's a long. You can't go through the whole thing of the blessings and the curses, but give us your condensed version of it.
Okay, so good. You set 6 of the tribes on Mount Gerizim to pronounce blessings, 6 of the tribes on Mount Ebal to pronounce curses. Ark of the Covenant is in the middle with the least and with the priest, and it goes something like this, taking those specific curses and blessings. From Mount Gerizim, they would echo across the valley. Blessed is the man who does not worship an idol. From Mount Ebal, they answer back, yes and amen. Then from Mount Ebal, cursed is the man who worships an idol. From Mount Gerizim, they answer back, yes and amen. And then they do the same thing with honoring your father and mother and all these various aspects. Yes. And it goes on all day long. It's an affirmation. It's binding them to this covenant, which when we get to the tablet itself, you'll see that's really what it is.
So they couldn't complain that the preacher went past lunch.
I think they ate a big breakfast that day because it was going to be a long day.
Yeah, something along those lines. So let's give the setting now. Time frame, time period, archaeological period, kind of thing, if you could, for the audience. Got about a minute for that.
Well, we're at the beginning of the conquest. So the Israelites have camped at Shittim, Joshua 2:1, Tal el-Hammam. They have crossed the Jordan at flood stage. They've camped at Gilgal. And from Gilgal, they've had the conquest of Jericho, Joshua chapter 6. They go up, probably the Wadi Kelt, into the hill country, and they have this defeat at Ai and then a victory at Ai. And then immediately at the end of Joshua 8, they head north to do what Moses told them to do. When you gain a foothold, and that's exactly what they've got now with Jericho and Ai as a foothold, you're going to go north and renew covenant with me. And then from there, they're going to have the southern campaign and the northern campaign and ultimately end up at Shiloh.
Very good. All right. Well, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We're here with Dr. Scott Stripling. We're talking about Mount Ebal. We're going to be leading up to the discovery of the lead tablet, the curse tablet. And we're here also with the president of ABR, Scott Lancer, my friend and co-host. And we'll be right back after this message.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith. We're here talking about the greatest discovery in the history of the Associates for Biblical Research, the Mount Ebal Curse Tablet. So we're going to turn it over to my colleague Scott for the next question.
Yes, Adam Zertal. He's an important player in this whole conversation. Scott, tell us a little bit about him.
Well, he really is a fascinating person. Adam Zertal. So it sort of begins and ends with Zertal. His story is really interesting. He grows up on a kibbutz in Israel, and this whole kibbutzim movement is fascinating. It's communal, and it's really, they're practicing a form of communism. So along with communism, because most of these Jews migrated from Eastern Europe, and they brought with them that socialistic, communistic mindset. There were many religious Jews also, but not in the kibbutzim movement. And Zertal was raised in this very secular environment. So he's a cultural Jew, but he's not a religious Jew. So he's not read the Bible. And the War for Independence comes about, and he fights in the war. He's a hero. He's wounded badly in his legs during the war, which later in his life he's going to end up on crutches. For an archaeologist, it's quite a challenge. But he's assigned, he's a professor at Haifa University, so he gets a PhD in archaeology, but he's not a student of the Bible. Now here's what's very interesting. Some of our Israeli colleagues do know their Bible very, very well. Guys like Benjamin Mazar, I mean, they read their Bible daily. It was their go-to source. But many others don't. They favor the Egyptian literature, like the Amarna letters, or the Mesopotamian literature, say out of Ugarit and so forth. But the biblical literature is set aside because it's not thought to be reliable. And this was Zertal. So as a professor of archaeology at Haifa University, he is doing a Manasseh Hill Country survey. Well, Ephraim and Manasseh territory is much larger than the other tribal territories. The sons of Joseph get a much larger portion. So he's surveying this very large area, and he comes to Mount Ebal. And on Mount Ebal, he comes to this very large structure. It's called El Bernat A, the Arabic name of it today. And he can tell that it's something, but he doesn't know what it is. He begins to uncover this. What he calls a mantle is intentionally covering some sort of structure. And as he uncovers the mantle, he can tell that it is an important structure, and he decides to do an excavation. And as he's excavating, he's puzzled. He just doesn't know what it is until a member of his team comes to him and shows him Joshua chapter 8. And he says, look, Professor, you know, the Bible says Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal. We're on Mount Ebal. The pottery seems to be dating to this time period. Have you thought about this? And Zertal said, no, I really hadn't. And they bring him a drawing of what the biblical altar looked like, and Zertal is in shock. And this then begins this transformation in his thinking, where he ultimately arrives at the place that he believes that this is Joshua's altar, and he also believes that the Bible is a reliable historical source. So it's a major transformation that takes place.
Yeah, that's a tremendous story. This mantle you speak of, Scott, is that a stone just covering? So it's, when it was removed, stone by stone by stone.
That's right, and it was intentionally covered in his view. So it was venerated, and then it was covered up, kind of like Göbekli Tepe, intentionally covered up. So all he had to do was carefully, with his team, remove that stone to reveal what was there, which was, of course, a rectangular altar that was 9 by 7 meters with a ramp on the west and a round altar underneath it at the perfect geometric center.
Very good. Now, Scott, this is the obvious question. What led ABR to begin working at Mount Ebal, or to be involved in sifting at Mount Ebal?
Well, we're interested in the conquest. That's our area of research focus. All the historical periods matter to us, but our primary area of research focus is the conquest. So having worked at Khirbet el-Maqader, the likely site of biblical Ai, and having done research at other sites, we were trying to understand, what did the Israelites do after Ai? They went to Mount Ebal. And we have a biblical text there, so it was a very natural extension of this. Zertal unfortunately died before completing his final publication. He did a very good provisional report in Tel Aviv Journal, 100 pages, but he died before we got the final account. And so there were a lot of questions that we had. We were very interested in exploring it, but the politics came into play and made this very difficult, because in 1993, the West Bank, so-called West Bank, Judea, Samaria of Israel, was divided into 3 parts with the Oslo Accords, A, B, and C. And B, which is where the altar was placed, just in area B, was under Israeli military control and Palestinian civil control. So it wasn't clear who was in charge. And so to get a license is very problematic. What we decided we could do was we could take the dump pile, because this was pre-1993, it wasn't an excavation, and we could just re-examine the garbage, essentially. And you know, we archaeologists love garbage, and we love to talk trash. And so through a long series of really providential events, we were able to relocate a portion of the dump pile, about 30% of it, to a nearby community, build a sifting station, and process that material.
Very good. So a couple things. One is we've done an episode with you on the altar itself in the past. So we just want to refer our audience to that on our YouTube channel. They can watch that sort of to supplement this. Now you're going to make some updated comments about some of the evidence because that was, I think, 3 years ago. Now we got a little bit more than a minute here. I want you to comment on this because some people in the audience I'm sure pick this up and go, wait a minute. People are doing biblical archaeology and they're not reading the Bible. What's up with that? Like, just give us your thoughts about that, because that's got to sound odd to some people.
Well, it is odd to be in the land of the Bible, excavating biblical sites, and to ignore the biblical text. And I'm not saying that all scholars do that, because many read the Bible very carefully to look for clues, but many don't. And that's idea that the Bible is guilty until proven innocent, and it's giving us mere mythology or teleological legends. So we need heroes. So we would say, sort of culturally, studying mythology, all cultures need heroes. And so we create stories so that we do have heroes like Joshua. Great warriors, people to admire, people who conquered kingdoms. They were at a disadvantage, yet they overcame. And some cultures have done that, quite frankly. You know, the Romans, to some extent, created a history. You know, they descended from the Etruscans, and they were slaves in their history, but they give it this grandiose thing, you know, we were descended from Troy. So those accusations were made, and once they stick, they're hard to overcome.
Yeah, and that's in the academic paradigm. And we just, again, something we mentioned for our audience over and over again that we emphasize is that paradigms control the way that people evaluate evidence. And a lot of what we're suggesting breaks paradigms, or we're suggesting re-examine the paradigm. The paradigm could be wrong. Friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We're here with Dr. Scott Stripling, the president of ABR, Scott Lancer. We're talking about Mount Ebal, and we'll be right back.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith. I'm your co-host. I'm here with Scott Lancer, the president of ABR, and archaeologist Dr. Scott Stripling, who's also the director of our excavations at Biblical Shiloh. I want to invite you to join us at Shiloh on our next dig season. Just go to our website, digshiloh.org, if you'd like to volunteer in the field. If what we're talking about today gets you excited, you want to come to Shiloh and discover what it's like to be in the field. All right, so Scott, you're up with the next question, sir.
Yeah, Scott, we talked about ABR's involvement in the work at Mount Ebal, but a very important aspect of this was new technology. Wet sifting is something that you've been strongly advocating for, and it's something that we used, and in fact that was integral in this discovery.
Right. It's a technology that is changing the way that archaeology must be done in the future. And so we were sitting at Shiloh on the last day of the 2018 season, and a group of Israeli scholars and friends had come to visit, even though the last day of the dig is a very busy day for me, but that's the day that they were able to come. And we're sitting right by our wet sifting station, and they're just sort of marveling at how we're processing these finds and how we've exponentially increased the finds. And people have been aware of wet sifting. It started back in the 1930s at Lachish with Starkey. And Starkey was so brilliant that we actually have pictures of him with sort of local workers, but they're, from our perspective now, very primitively, but they are washing this material and examining it. and finding amazing things. Starkey's murdered at Damascus Gate, and so just a tremendous loss to the field of archaeology. And his students, his disciples, just sort of dropped the idea of wet sifting. And I know why, because it's expensive and it's time consuming. So it was just sort of forgotten. I mean, nobody knew anything about it until Gabi Barkai, about 16, 17 years ago, began to take, along with Zaki Swig, began to take the Temple Mount matrix that had been torn out of the southeast corner of the Temple Mount, dumped into the Kidron Valley, and started the Temple Mount sifting project. And so ABR sent teams a couple of years on that. I worked for 2 years as a supervisor on that project. And that's where I became a big believer in wet sifting. It still was not being done at all in the field. So I made up my mind at Kerbet al-Makadar. Of course, we didn't have any water, so we couldn't do it there.
Right.
But in our next dig, if we had water, we were going to actually do it in situ, where we could examine that material. So it was just revolutionary. So as I was talking with our Israeli friends and colleagues there, this is where they were bemoaning the fact that we could not do an excavation or partner on something. And this is where I kind of had an epiphany, and I said, well, look where we are. Look at the wet sifting station. What if we just took the garbage dump and went through that? We would probably find important evidence that they missed. That was the genesis of the idea. And then our friends and supporters came along and gave us money and helped us, and we got some political help to pave a road that needed to be paved, and military permission and so forth. And ultimately, we were able to relocate that dump pile to Shavishomron nearby and to pull off the project.
Excellent. You know, it's amazing to me, just as a side note, the sovereignty of God, that we sent a group to the Temple Mount Sifting Project. You independently, before you were with ABR, before we knew each other, but not close, that you already had this idea brewing, and then it converged with Shiloh and eventually here with Mount Ebal. Now, we're going to set aside for a moment the wet sifting. We're going to come back to it. But let's talk about the altar a little bit more. I would like you to wrap up this episode by just explaining a little bit more about what's in the altar, what Zertal found, and what you've seen.
Okay, there are two levels within this altar complex, stratum 1 and stratum 2. So the dating options are pretty simple. Is it iron 1 or is it LB2? So it's not a multi-period site. And this rectangular altar that he first found that got his attention, 9 by 7 meters with a ramp on the west, was clearly from the Iron Age 1 period. So you're talking around the year 1200 or just after the year 1200. So it's in that early part of the Iron Age. The pottery is very unique, very distinctive of that time period, and it's everywhere. And it's 97% of the pottery lying around is from that period. Underneath that altar, at the perfect geometric center, is an earlier round altar, and this has gotten almost no attention up to this point. What has been written about the altar, and people have done dissertations on this and so forth, has all been about the rectangular altar, with the assumption that there was an exodus that occurred in the 13th century, what's the so-called late date. They just loved this 13th century altar because it fit with that paradigm.
On the surface, that would make sense.
Until you start looking
on the surface, right?
But go down a little deeper, and underneath it is a round altar at its perfect geometric center. Now, symmetry doesn't happen by coincidence in the ancient world. When you find something that's at the perfect geometric center, it's intentional. And Zertal himself called this the primogenial cultic site at Mount Ebal, referring to that earlier altar. That's the altar that dates to an earlier period. Clearly, it's beneath it. Now, Zertal thought it was just from like maybe a generation before that, because in his mind, he'd never even heard of the biblical date of the Exodus, but he had heard people like Albright and others who had talked about this so-called late date. But our examination of the pottery and the other finds, I think we'll go deeper into this later, indicates that it's actually back to what we would call the late bronze 1B, late bronze 2A horizon around 1400 BC, which coincides very nicely with the biblical date.
Okay, that's a great overview of the day. We'll get into in our next episode, because believe it or not, this one's already done. So that's a great overview. Want to encourage folks to go back and watch the first episode we did on Mount Ebal with Dr. Stripling to give you some more of the archaeology. We're going to cover some more of that in our next 3 episodes here on the discussion of the Mount Ebal Curse Tablet. We're thankful that you've joined us here. We thank you that you support the ministry of ABR. We encourage you to go to our website and our YouTube channel to find out more about the ministry of ABR. We're grateful that you tuned in today to watch the show. Come back next time for our next episode of Digging for Truth, Part 2 on the Mount Ebal Curse Tablet. Thank you for joining us today.